Director Merrill.
So back in June of 2017, Kevin Laccasse came to the council along with his architect, Jay Barrett, because he was looking at buying the Goddard Block and doing a pretty significant project there. But he recognized that there weren't enough parking spaces on site for him to do the project. And at the time, the councils said work with the staff and come back to see us. So that's kind of why we're here. I'm going to give you just a very brief summary of what we have been working on down there. So one of the things we wanted to approach was sort of the whole Pleasant Street, that whole block, and try to come up with a parking plan that would meet both commercial and residential uses and support investment in those buildings so that upper levels would be finished and we'd see improvements down there. So we did get a parking garage study done by Walker Associates, and we had that. They looked at the area behind the Oddfellows building and a 2-level parking garage. We were sort of surprised by the number when it came back. I think disappointed is probably, the best way to put it. It's $4.9 million for 119 spaces, $4.7 million, $38,000 a spot. So, Ryan and I, when we were looking at the designs that they gave us, we realized that of that 119 spaces, 50 of them were on the main level, right on the surface lot. Right now, it's all gravel, and there's no identification of spaces, and it doesn't look like it would fit that many cars, but it made us kind of relook at surface parking and what we might be able to do there. So we had a stakeholders meeting with all the building owners on that first block, or their representatives. Some of them couldn't come up, and to talk about putting together a really cohesive and collaborative parking plan behind all of the buildings. There's a lot of wasted space back there. Every building owner's got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and they're kind of here, there, and everywhere. You can't access it from one point. There's no clear egress. And our feeling is that if we do this right, we can get a lot more surface parking down there than is down there now. So that was sort of part 2. We'll continue to meet with that group. And you're also going to see in your proposed 18-19 budget, there is money in there for engineering design for Pleasant Street revitalization, but part of that, and that includes some of this parking that we're talking about. That's a piece of that. In the meantime, we met with the American Legion as well on this specific project, because the parking that Mr. Laccasse is looking at is right behind the Goddard Block, and we wanted to make certain that they were going to be okay with that impact. So they were fine as long as we left the line of spaces right next to their building. And this plan does that, so it does not impact those spaces right next to the Legion building. With the zoning variance for his project, when he initially came in, he was talking about needing 17 spaces. The way that the architect just designed the building, he can now get 36 units of housing in there. So the actual request is for 22 spaces. So he has, if you look on that map, what we've laid out, there are 14 of the 36 spaces that are required to meet the site plan. 14 of them are on Mr. Laccasse's lot. That's the in red there. The other 22, which you see are where we're recommending them now, they're in blue. The agreement that we're looking at, the draft that we have that we worked out, allows us to change the location of these spaces if the final parking plan suggests that they be somewhere else, as long as they're within 1,000 feet of the building, which is 2 blocks. So for now, you know, at this point in time, these spaces would be located as they're shown on the map, but if after all of this parking work, somebody comes back and says, here's the magic bullet, and this is where we want all the residential parking, we could move the location. So that's what you have in front of you, and Mr. Laccasse is here, and
So, just so everybody knows, we're just seeing this tonight, so it's a lot to digest.
it is.
Um,
And I apologize, I didn't realize his proposed closing on his lot was coming up so quickly, or we would have put it on your April agenda item.
When's the closing?
Yeah, April 6th?
April 6th.
April 6th.
Yeah, so that's why you got it so late.
Counselor Kier?
Is there any thought to or knowledge of what impact losing those 22 public parking spaces will be?
So the parking study that we had done last year, when we looked at that lot, it's not very heavily used. The other thing we've looked at and we've discussed as part of this rental agreement with him is basically some shared parking during the daytime. So it would be restricted parking from like 5 p.m. to 8 a.m., but during the day, if there were empty spaces, other people could use them. And that was recommended in the parking study, that we look at shared parking as one way of dealing with the residential and the commercial need.
So, if I may, who owns this land?
The lot
Yeah, because I know it's a hodgepodge, but this area that you're talking about
is city.
is city.
Yeah.
And why did we go with a rental agreement and not just convey the land?
And not a what?
Convey the land, do a land transfer.
I think because there are other, again, we might move these based on what we see in the next 10 months on an overall parking plan. It may be that they're best staying where they are. It may be that we'll have a traffic engineer come in here and say, we can make these horizontal, not vertical, and add 20 more spaces there. So there's still some movement on where they're going to go.
As part of the downtown stakeholder meeting that we began on Friday, some of those property owners had identified structures connected to their buildings that they intend to have demolished, which will free up more surface level area. Some of the other owners also identified adjacent properties that, you know, as part of a public-private partnership, they may acquire and demolish to create more surface level parking. Some of it the city may acquire and demolish to create more surface level parking.
So if I may back up, just because we have new council members. Back in June 28th, I believe, at our council meeting, when Mr. Laccasse and Jay Barrett first came to the council, I think Jay Barrett was very forthright, and he said, I'm really here to shake you down for some parking spaces. I think those were his words. And there was a sense at that meeting that they would like to have the council take a vote on the parking. We did not do that at that time because after discussion from the council, we wanted to have the city come back with a plan that would show fairness across the board, because we have a lot of property owners downtown who have complained in the past about parking, and we, don't want to get into, set a precedent where we're favoring one property owner over the other. Whatever we do has to be fair across the board. So at that point in time, they did, state to the council they understood they would have to go before the ZBA for the variance, because our ordinances say for every unit downtown and district you have to have 1.5 parking spaces. That variance was granted by the ZBA to 1 parking space per unit. At the time, they also went to the planning board with their plans, and it, if I remember right, the plan that Mr. Barrett showed at that point in time was really more the external of the building, and something very general about, because there was a lot of discussion at that point in time how many actual units there would be. I think at the planning board meeting, it was stated, he said, I think 30 to 32. So at the planning board meeting, they were talking about 17 spaces, and one of the conditions of the approval was the parking had to be resolved before a certificate of occupancy was granted. So tonight, we're here because it's my understanding, Mr. Laccasse could probably speak better to this, is that he has a closing date, April 6th, and I believe, I would rather have him speak because he's involved in the closing.
Absolutely.
And that is, this has to be resolved in order for him to complete the closing. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you guys for hearing me tonight. I'm Kevin Laccasse with New England Family Housing. So, do you want me to just, for the benefit of the new council members, just kind of go through the process of where we're
Might be
at with the
helpful.
project? So, back, last early spring or whatever, I became aware that the Goddard Block had been shut down by the city due to severe code violations and deterioration of that building. At that time, as a property owner and landlord in town, I showed interest in the building. I contacted the current owner, spoke to him about it, looked at the project, at doing it just with basically private funding. And when I walked through the building, I realized why the city had shut it down. So it's in very severe disrepair, beyond any private investment capital could do to bring it back to to some use. So we looked at a couple different plans on it. The whole first floor was commercial, as you all know, and then the top 2 floors were residential. All the commercial had been vacant, and there wasn't really a demand for it. So there was, all these different issues with it. But the number one issue with the building is that it didn't have substantial parking to support even the residents that were currently living in there. So our first go, no-go gauge, so to speak, was to come before city council at the time and say, look, can we work with you guys? And Jay said it exactly, shake you down for some parking spaces. And that was basically our first, go around with the city to find out, if there was support for the project and so forth. And at the time, city council members voted unanimously in favor to basically direct city staff to work with us to come up with a solution for the parking. So that, led us down the line to go to the next step. So we had a couple variances we needed approved, so we went in front of the zoning board. One of them was to reduce the parking requirements from 1.5 spaces per unit down to 1. And the other was to allow for first floor residential on Pleasant Street. So both of those variances were unanimously approved, and again, we were, thanked for our investment in Claremont and so forth. We went forward, put together the funding, and we needed LIHTC grant fundings through New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, as well as funding through CDFA, a CDBG grant through CDFA, as well as historic tax credits. So for the following 8 or 9 months, I had worked, with these different agencies and made applications and so forth, and was able to secure all that funding. So given that it's a tax credit project, there's investors in the deal, and they have certain requirements that have to be met. So basically, the overall construction, just the construction budget alone for this project is $7.5 million. The overall project costs are a lot more. That's just hard construction. So that's the type of investment we're talking about putting into Pleasant Street and Claremont. So one of the requirements of the investor, if they're going to invest their capital into this project, they need to know that certain things are secured. And just like our first, inclination was, we need parking. Well, before they put a dime into the project, they need to know that that parking is secured too. So that's kind of why I went back to Nancy and said, you know, I know we, through the site plan approval process, said, you know, as long as we work something out by CO, by the time we get our certificate of occupancy, we'll be okay. Well, when I brought that information back to the tax credit investors, they were pretty adamant about saying, well, we're not willing to take the risk of putting in, you know, upwards of $10 million into a project without having this secured first. So I went and talked to Nancy and said, you know, can we really look at getting, you know, a lease contract for these spaces in line, because I need that in order to go to closing. And I guess we were under the impression that in our last June meeting, June last year, that we did have, or that authority was granted to the city manager to be able to execute that document. And in looking back, apparently that wasn't done. So that's kind of where we're at now, and what brings us to the table of asking for your support once again in allowing that to go forward. So.
Yeah, to be clear, I reviewed the tape, and the council was very clear that whatever the plan was for the parking, that the city administration would take into account.
Yeah.
That there was equity across the board.
Right, and with that being said, I agree with that, and I feel that this project was a catalyst to really get that conversation moving in the right direction.
I would agree.
And as City Manager McNutt mentioned, we did meet, well, and Nancy mentioned it too, we met last Friday with all the stakeholders and really had support from everybody. Throughout all these municipal meetings that we've been through and public notifications, there has not been one abutting property owner that has come forth and said, that's not fair that you're giving spaces to them, and we need some too. I think everybody sees it as a collaborated effort, and this is just a catalyst to really solve the overall parking problem that we have in the whole, you know, Pleasant Street area of Claremont. So, you know, from that, I think it is equal and fair across everybody, because it's really what's getting the conversation going and getting some solutions brought to the table.
Okay. Any comments? Councilor Ahern.
I only have one comment, and I reviewed the tape too, because I was curious. I looked at the excerpts, and it wasn't enough information, so I went back and looked at the recording. And I don't know if the questions that the councilors had at that meeting have been answered tonight.
Such as?
Well, I'm just trying to remember. They sent, you know, there was like 3 councilors, including Councilor Pope, I believe, asked for certain information, and that it be brought back with proposals.
I think that was an overall parking plan, and I think what's happened since then, and city manager can correct me if I'm wrong, that he and his administration have spent some time since that meeting in June talking to other property owners and starting the process of resolving the parking issue downtown. Back in June, because we hadn't gone down this road yet, I mean, Mr. Laccasse was just presenting, it was just being heard by the council. That evening, I think, several of us heard from another property owner said, well, you know, I've been complaining about this for quite some time. So if those dynamics have changed, that's good. I mean, that was one of our main concerns. Councilor Keir?
I'd also like to speak to, because I'm on the zoning board,
Okay.
and when he came in front of the zoning board, there were other property owners, or there was at least one other property owner who came as well, and at the end actually spoke and said that he was happy to hear that the city was open to working with property owners to reduce the requirements so that they could begin to put in apartments or fix up their areas, et cetera. So I think there was concern, and that's why he came, but after hearing everything that was going on and kind of what our thoughts on it was, he was actually kind of happy to hear that the city was working with other property owners and thought it would be helpful for him in the future.
And what's good from a city administration perspective is that they're not just working with Mr. Laccasse, they're working with the other property owners about the same issue. Mr. Laccasse just happens to be the first person coming forward with a huge reconstruction project.
Yeah, and just to be, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Well, what I was going to say is we're not asking for, you know, specific, I mean, Nancy had shared a map showing where we're originally dedicating some space to. However, in the lease agreement still, we're working out details, but those aren't the hard fixed spaces that I may have forever to hold. Basically, they're saying it's a certain amount of spaces. So if the overall parking plan changes and it makes more sense for the city to say, your residents are no longer allowed to use these spaces, we're going to assign you these spaces over here because it makes more sense. There's flexibility on the city's behalf to do that. So it's not saying we're taking these and no one else can ever have them. If it makes more sense, for everybody to move us in a different location, that's fine. So that's one of the details that was kind of, in the contract from the beginning, so.
Councilor Pope?
Yeah, I'm on board with the idea of, granting the parking places and leases. I hope that when we, and I got a couple questions on the drawing, but the drawing, I'm not sure I can ask too many questions on that, but that we actually see a finished, at some point, either planning board or us, just maybe an FYI to the council, see the actual engineer drawing of where the parking places would be, because, the SketchUp I've got right here now probably wouldn't work for an actual parking lot, but it's a good start.
Probably not.
But the other question I have is there are some lease spaces that go right down to, I think it's where a lawyer's office currently is now. And I guess I'd ask city staff to make sure that that's not going to create an impediment for vehicles entering and leaving on that exit, or perhaps change that exit. There's 2 exits on that lot and 1 entry. Maybe look at the 2 exit idea and see how that works out.
So, 2 entrances.
Yeah, from our meeting on Friday, a number of things sort of came up. One of the things were there were other building owners that would like to see the parking requirement changed down to 1 parking spot per dwelling unit. So they would like to, explore that as a zoning change, a more permanent zoning change, not as a variance process. And then secondly, as Director Merrill spoke about, we're going to have a traffic consultant as part of our Pleasant Street revitalization, and that may mean exactly what you're talking about, the reconfiguration of certain lots and means of egress and exit.
Good enough. I'd speak to it more in a meeting.
Yeah, so as far as engineered plans, I think it would be a combination of what the city's report comes up with and the engineered plans that are done through that process, as well as where we are at right now in this process. We've gone out, we did an RFQ to select a contractor for the project. We got a bunch of responses from that. Based off of that pool, we went out for an RFP, and the bid opening is actually on Friday. So we'll be selecting a construction manager to be working with our architect to develop the full scale of the project and all the engineered drawings and all the bid prices and all that stuff. So that's all in process. And if all goes well, we should be starting construction hopefully in late May, early June is kind of my best guess right now.
So you need this parking issue resolved for your closing.
I do.
So I have a couple of legal questions perhaps Director Merrill could help us with, because we don't have legal counsel present, and that is, I'm concerned about the integrity of a site application, the future integrity of a site application. So is a rental agreement for parking spaces the same as designated parking spaces, or is that a different matter entirely?
So this, the documents, the drafts that we've been working off of were created by an attorney. And he recommended that it be a rental agreement as opposed to a lease because there are underlying property rights that go with leases that don't go with rental agreements. Small legal thing. I do not think that it will impact the site integrity. We can go back and take a look at that and what was presented.
Because that would be my concern. When I spoke to our legal office about this afternoon, because I wanted to be sure we had a vote on it tonight, and he would not be here. And that is, how do you ensure that it's the best approach? land conveyance, easement, space designation.
Correct.
And according to him,
Yep.
he said that what you don't want to do is designate space. It impacts the integrity of the site application. So
I'm not sure I understand, but we can certainly,
please look into it, because it's important to Mr. Laccasse, to us, that we do this in the best manner possible. Yes, Counselor Stone?
Do we actually have a rough draft of the lease agreement?
we have a rough draft that is, yes, city manager has, and I think Kevin's attorneys are looking at. So it's in negotiation.
Yeah, my attorney, and I didn't even send it back to Nancy yet, but our attorney has reviewed it, made a few comments. I don't think anything show-stopping on either side, but it's still kind of going, I believe, back and forth between our council and city's council.
Anything else? Yes.
I'm just going to say I have a problem with, with the question that you just brought up and Councilor Stone brought up. And not being able to look at the rental agreement. Only thing we have is a drawing and a motion, and or proposed motion.
So, just as, obviously, it's up to you folks. We have not typically had you folks looking at full contracts and leases in the past. I think it's typically been authorization to allow the manager to negotiate and sign as long as there were parameters that you felt comfortable with. So, I think that what we're looking at now is a $25 a month per space lease that can be reopened every 5 years.
You just said lease, but it's not.
Excuse me,
It's a rental.
$25 per month per space. Rental.
Yeah.
Excuse me, the rental that can be reopened every 5 years. It has an accelerator that's Consumer Price Index as part of that. It's conditioned, obviously, on the project being done, and it has a number of items in there, like people can't change their oil, their cars have to be registered and inspected, and it has a requirement for liability, and also for the landlord to give stickers or identification and be responsible for enforcement of their parking agreement with the city. So those are the sort of the main items in it. And I don't know sort of what their attorney's sending back, but
But
that's
this
what we
could all
sent to them.
change, where these spaces are, it could change based on,
Space location could change based on the overall parking plan that comes out of the next, as I said, 10 months.
right. Counselor Zullo.
Yeah, I would just like to speak that I'm the gentleman, Mr. Laccasse, is willing to spend $10 million in our city if we gotta sacrifice up a couple public parking spaces that are never used, because I've been through the parking lot, they're very rarely used. I think it's an excellent idea, and I'm on board.
Yeah, we're just trying to figure out the finer details.
Right.
I hope, Mr. Laccasse, you're not getting the impression we don't support your project, because
That's
did
the
in
impression
June.
that I was getting.
So if we're giving you that impression, we're sorry, but we have
Legalities.
we have responsibilities that go beyond just your
No,
project.
I understand. I
think
figure that we'd
Mr.
have to
Barrett-
work through those, but I appreciate your comments as well. It's very much appreciated.
We're not trying to minimize it at all. Counselor
Has a
Pope.
motion been made on this yet?
You have the motion in front of you, it hasn't been made yet.
No, I'd like to make a motion with that. I just want to get this rolling, so.
Okay, are there any other concerns?
I'll make the motion that make sure I get the right motion here. The Claremont City Council hereby authorizes the city manager or his designees to take all such actions as may be required to execute a parking rental agreement for 22 parking spaces between the city and Goddard Block Limited Partnership for the benefit of 54 through 62 Pleasant Street, also known as the Goddard Block. This agreement is subject to the conditions that Goddard complete the renovations prior to the agreement commencement date.
Is there a second?
Second.
So the motion was made by Counselor Pope and seconded by Counselor Kier. Any further discussion before we take the final? Yes.
There's several questions. Could you tell me again the length of the rental agreement?
5 years.
5 years?
It's 20 total with 5-year, reopens every 5 years for renegotiation.
Okay. Okay, so.
And it can be mutually changed at any time. if
All right.
both parties agree.
So it will always be for 22 parking spaces. We just aren't sure of where those 22 spaces will be. Is that correct?
Correct.
But the number of 22 will always be fixed.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. It isn't as, I guess where I'm hung up is with the discussion with the city's council that, or, legal office, that a conveyance in some manner of the parking spaces might be the better way to go, but
We've not, I don't know that I would recommend conveying city-owned land. That's a permanent conveyance.
I know,
Excuse
I know.
me.
I mean, I'd be open to that, but
Yeah.
obviously.
Well,
And I appreciate that comment. If that would make it easier, I certainly would be open to that. But it doesn't sound like that's in the best interest of the city.
I can appreciate that this motion and the rental agreement leaves all the options open. We've got the ability to move it around. This is wide open. I can appreciate that, I guess. Okay.
Yes, Counselor Pope.
Just my final question, I think almost a comment, but Director Merrill, didn't we also do something much like this in a similar case with the building by what used to be the Laccasse Theater, which now has the apartments? We created some leased
That's his-
parking
his
spaces.
property.
I can answer that.
Good, okay, sorry. Well,
No,
was thinking
I'm the
situation
one
on ours.
that, yeah, it was a few years ago. I think it was back in 2010, I did that project. And we put an elevator in that building and were able to reutilize the top 2 floors. With that, though, there was no flexibility given to me whatsoever on parking spaces. In fact, I had to buy 579 School Street in order to gain the amount of land required in order to get the parking that I needed in there to support the Laccasse Theater building. The flexibility, I suppose, that I was given at that time was to allow a cross lease to occur between the 2 properties, even though they were purchased under the same entity. But no, I was fortunate enough on that one where there was enough land owned in fee that I was able to kind of fix it on my own. But that did nothing to help the abutting property owners that have no land at all. So I think this is kind of a catalyst to open up to benefit the greater public or the greater, stakeholders of Pleasant Street. So,
Very good. I remembered something we'd done like that.
yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for explaining.
Okay, anything else? Okay, all those I don't need a roll call for this. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you, Mr. Laccasse.
Thank you. I appreciate it and look forward to getting the project underway.
Oh,
Okay.
I do have a question for you. In
Okay.
reviewing the tape,
Yeah.
several of the counselors showed interest in touring the building before
Okay.
the renovation, the rehab, whatever, it's
Perfect.
gutting the
Okay.
building occurs.
Yeah.
So you said at that point you'd be willing to do that. I don't know if
Sure.
that's still the case, but I think we still have counselors who would be interested.
No, absolutely. I think maybe we could put together like a groundbreaking ceremony and kind of make it a little bit, more public and just allow,
Still gross inside?
Oh, it's very gross. It's a sight to see, trust me. And pictures don't do justice for the smell in the building, so.
Probably not.
It'll be quite a tour, but, we can set that up through Nancy or city manager's
there-
office or whatever.
Any precautions we should take so that we don't bring anything back to our own homes?
I would knock your feet off when you come out of the building, but no, other than that, I mean, it's, you can walk through it. I mean, there's, you know, some water damage and some smells and stuff. You might not want to lean against some of the walls, but, no, there's nothing caving in or, you know, outlandish dangers like that, but no, I'd love to get you guys in at the beginning, and, you know, whether we make it more of a public event or just kind of a private tour for city council, either way, I'm open to it, or both. And then, obviously, during construction, I'd love to, you know, invite everybody in. As a matter of fact, we're doing a project right now in Bristol as well, and that's a ground-up new construction. And one of the things that we're finding in the construction field is that there's a shortage of younger people that are coming into the trades, all trades, be it construction, be it whatever. I had made the proposition at the time to allow students from the high school that are involved in some of these programs to go through an actual working site and get some hands-on. You know, I don't know about all the formal processes of that, but I'd love to throw that out there and invite, you know, select groups from the, you know, from the Claremont school that are interested in trades, and give some tours so people can see hands-on what it's like to have a building in construction. So, you know, I mean, it just kind of got me thinking when you said a tour through that, but I think it would be a benefit for, you know, the overall community in that regard
Well,
as
it's
well.
very
so.
generous to offer.
Yeah, give me a card. Get that to the people you need to know.
Yeah, okay, great.
And then at the
I work
June,
with them.
Oh, perfect.
and then the other request made at the June meeting, June 28th of last year,
Yeah.
was could we somehow do, on a not so much a continual feed, but just progress that you're making within the building before it's finished, and have it put up on the website or wherever you want to put it. But it, just to create the excitement of what's happening downtown.
Love to, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, you might want to explore creating a project webpage, which could be sort of catalyzing towards your marketing efforts once
Right.
it's finished.
Absolutely, and you know, I have a really good web designer on staff that that does do a lot with my website, and he's been toying with the idea of making specific pages for specific projects. So that's a really good point, and maybe we could do that and maybe link it to the city's page, or not quite. You know, that's above my
You don't do
knowledge
IT?
base, but
I don't either.
but yeah, no, that's a really good point. So
Okay. Well, thank you.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
So I
What's that?
get a card before I leave so I can get in contact.
Okay,
I work
yeah.
at the tech center
I'll
here,
grab
so
one
I
in
can